Hello everyone, my name is Rea, and today I'm going to be talking to you about style guide driven development and how we use it at Grubhub to modularize our Android UI. Now, for those of you who aren't familiar with Grubhub, we're the nation's leading online food ordering platform. We help connect diners, restaurants, and our delivery partners. To give you an idea of the scale that we're working at, we currently serve 2,400 markets in the United States. We have over 125,000 restaurants on our platform, and we currently serve 20.3 million diners every day. So let's take a look at what our app actually looks like across web, Android, and iOS. So if you were to visit Grubhub and go to the sign up page around late 2017, this is what you would see on mobile web, Android, and iOS. And you'll notice they all look very different from each other. But let me highlight a couple of things. If you look at mobile web, the button says sign in. On Android, it says sign up. And then on iOS, we call it login. So we're using different language across each of the platforms. Now you'll also notice, obviously we're using different colors. Web is using red, Android yellow, and iOS is using blue. And between web and mobile, we're using different styles of buttons. Now, these may seem like very minor issues, but it actually poses two fundamental problems. The first problem is we have a very inconsistent brand identity. Now, why is brand identity important? It's important because if I'm a user who always uses the website, if I decide to download the app one day because we want to push users to our app, I shouldn't be confused about how to use the app. It should look familiar to me already because I'm such a heavy user of the website. Now, the second problem is for our engineering and design teams. Fundamentally, where this comes from is that each engineering team for each platform has essentially created their own style guide to support their own platform. Now, the design team is already designing for each of the platforms, but now they have to keep in mind that each of the platforms differ in these very minute ways. So there's different colors that are being used on different platforms. We're working with different terminology, and they have to keep track of those things, as well as the engineering team keeping track of that. So how do we fix this? The first step that we took was to create a living style guide. Now, a living style guide basically consists of well-documented design patterns that can cover a broad range of use cases. So style guides, as we know today, is just basically a collection of those design patterns, but what do we mean by living? So living goes back to that whole concept of well-documented. The same way we update our documentation for our code every time it changes or for each of our releases, we want to make sure our design patterns are very well documented anytime there's a new design pattern introduced or if we make an update to an existing design pattern. Now, what's a design pattern? Design patterns can be anything as simple as color and typography, and they can lead up to even more complex things like how do we do navigation across our app? So let's take a look at how we build design patterns at Grubhub. So we use something called atomic design principles. Now, atomic design basically says when we build a design pattern, we want to build it as a building block, kind of like Legos. So what that means is we want to design it in such a way that once it's built and developed, we can use that to build more complex design patterns. So if you take a look at a button, it seems pretty straightforward and simple. But when you take a deeper look at it, you start to realize that buttons are actually made up of even smaller components like color to define the background color and the text color, shape to define how you want that button to look, for example, what type of corner radius, and typography to know how the text inside the button should look. What typeface do you want to use? What size should it be? Etc. So let's take a look at how to actually build a button. Now this is pretty straightforward. The first thing we do is we want to create a drawable. In this case, we'll define it as a rectangle, we'll define the corner radius, and we'll define what color we want. But what this really does is it just creates a shape, right? It's not actually a button. A button can be in many different states. It can be disabled, it can be pressed, it can be focused on. So in order to create a button, we need to really create a drawable to represent each of those states, and then ultimately assign it to a state selector. So with those 5 files, the 4 drawables to represent each state we want to build, plus the state selector, we can create the add to order button that you see on the screen. Now, the one thing that we haven't talked about yet is text selectors and how text can change for a button as you press on it, and it can be in various states, but we'll touch on that later. But keep in mind that to create this one button, we've essentially created 5 files. Now, that's not a tremendous effort, but it's not scalable if your style guide has 15 different types of buttons. You're going to end up repeating this process over and over again. It means that inevitably, when we decide to change the way a button looks in the future, we're going to have to update each of those single files for each button type. So it's clearly not scalable. So what we did was we decided to take a step back and explore what our other options were, and we stumbled across style guide driven development. Now, style guide driven development is essentially taking that living style guide that we talked about and making sure that it allows us to introduce new design patterns into our apps without disrupting our normal development. So we should still be able to release our apps to production without having to worry about how building a new design pattern will affect it. And we also want it to give us a scalable way of managing all these design patterns, so we're not continuously repeating the same effort to add a new design pattern in or a new type of that same design pattern. Now, style guide driven development isn't something new. It's been around for a while, but it's much more well established for web development. So if you've ever worked within React, there's lots of tools that help support it, such as Storybook.js, but none of those tools exist for native mobile development. So rather than letting that stop us or find another solution, we decided to instead leverage those principles and build our own solution in-house. And so what that led us to is something we like to call the Android Pattern Library. Now, the Android Pattern Library is basically just an Android library that lives outside of our normal production apps. And it consists of 2 modules, one being the pattern library and the other being a sample app. So the pattern library module is essentially where we build all of the design patterns, and that's where they live. The sample app then lets us be able to demonstrate how to use that design pattern and show all the potential configurations for that design pattern. So this architecture gives us a couple of benefits. One, all of our design patterns are now encompassed in a single library, and they can be used by any of our apps. So that means we've now built one single library that houses all the design patterns we want to use. Our Seamless Android app can use it, our Grubhub Android app can use it, and even our driver app can use it, so our delivery partners can benefit from it. The second benefit is that because it's a library, we can obviously version it. And by versioning it, we can help mitigate any risks we might have with releasing to production. So for example, one of the things that comes up often is if we want to introduce a new button or change the way a button looks, we can't do that on our production apps because it has to be tested before things can go to production, right? Now in this case, all we can do is add it to the pattern library, bump the version of the library, and then each of the production apps can actually choose when it's appropriate for them to update. The third benefit is that because we've built this sample app into the library itself, it allows us to demonstrate how to actually work with each of the design patterns, but it also gives us a really simple integration test to make sure that the patterns work the way we expect them to, and that the design team can actually VQA them ahead of time to make sure they behave the way we want them to throughout our apps. So let's take a look at buttons again. So this is a subset from our current style guide, and there's a couple of things that I want to point out here. So across the top, you'll see words like positive, negative, and brand. And you'll notice that positive is just really all the buttons are green to denote a positive action on the page, negative is orange, and brand is using our Grubhub brand color. So really what those words, positive, negative, and brand mean is they're defining what type of color scheme you want to use for that button. And by color scheme, what that helps us understand is what does that button look like in its normal state? What does it look like when it's pressed? What does it look like when it's disabled, etc. Now, across the right-hand side, you'll see type, and we have primary, secondary, and tertiary. And you'll notice that primary, for instance, has that solid background to help denote that it's going to be a primary action on the page. Secondary is an outline, and tertiary basically looks like a hyperlink. And so what type really tells us at the end of the day is how this button should look, like what it should actually look within the UI. Now, the third thing that's not pictured here, but that's also important for buttons, is size. Depending on the size that we choose for our button, that helps us understand what the padding and margin should be for the text and the button itself. So let's take a look at how this is actually built. Now, buttons are a very inherent thing in Android. We already have ways of building them. We don't necessarily want to change how they function. We just want to change the way they look so that they match our brand identity. So what we did was we essentially created a custom view class called button that extends app-compat button. Now, at the time at which we built this, we were on version 7 of the support library, which is why we're extending app-compat button. But I'll come back to that in a little bit. Once we've created this custom view, the next step is to create custom attributes for that view. And what you'll notice is those attributes essentially reflect what we saw in the style guide. We've created a button type attribute that takes in values to help us understand how to build a button to have the appropriate look. We have a button size attribute that's going to tell us the appropriate padding and margin values to use for that button. And we have a button color scheme that, depending on the value, will select the appropriate colors to use for each of the states of that button. Now, the one other thing that you'll notice here is that we have default values for each of these attributes. And the reason we chose to do that is because we wanted to stress functionality over UI. So hopefully, most of the time, people will use this correctly, but in the off chance you happen to miss an attribute, worst case scenario, your button will not look the way you want it to, and that should be caught at minimum at the very last stage of testing before we release. So it's fairly low risk, and what we wanted to prevent was having any null exceptions or anything of that sort, which is why we set default values. So let's take a look at this add to order button again. Now, if you recall from earlier, we had to create a drawable for each state and then add it to the state selector. Now, instead of creating each of those files for this button, we can just drop in this snippet of code. And that's essentially dropping in our custom button into the UI and setting 3 attributes on it. So in this case, we want to use the normal color scheme, which is what gives us the blue in the normal state, and it gives us a dark blue when it's pressed. We want to use the normal button size, and we're going to use a primary button, so you have that solid background there. Now, what this does behind the scenes is it essentially still creates those drawable files programmatically and still assigns it to a state selector, which is then assigned back to the button itself. But because it's happening programmatically, now this can support any and all types of buttons we want in our style guide, all in one single class. So let's take a closer look. So the way color schemes work is it's essentially an enumeration. So in this case, when we say we want to use the normal color scheme, it really tells us we want to use our interactive color, which is blue in this case, for the default state, and what other colors to use for the focused and pressed states. So really, once we get that color scheme, we're looking it up via the enumeration and extracting the colors that we want to use for each of these states. The next step is, as I mentioned before, programmatically building out that button. So there's 2 steps here. The first step is building out the background selector, which essentially takes in the type and the size that we want. It takes in the colors that we've extracted from the color scheme, and it starts to build each of those drawables for each state and assigns it back to a stateless drawable that we can use for our button. The next step is doing the same thing for the text. Now, if you recall earlier, we didn't even talk about text, and normally that would be an additional couple of files to manage that for each of the types of buttons. But now it's just a couple of extra lines of code, still within the initialization of our button, that follows the same process of extracting the colors from our color scheme, understanding what type and size we want, and generating a color stateless to use for our text. Now, that's great that it works for all of the buttons that we have in our initial style guide, but as most of you know, style guides tend to evolve over time. We want to introduce new button types, new color schemes, things of that nature. So what we wanted to do was, rather than waiting for someone to tell us we're going to have a new color scheme or a new button type, or we're going to modify an existing design pattern, what the engineering team has done is essentially we've enabled some flexibility for each design pattern where it's appropriate. In the case of buttons, if we wanted to introduce a new custom color scheme, we'd have to first, we would receive it from design. The next step would be to actually add it into our pattern library, and then our apps could actually use it, right? Once they've upgraded to the latest version of the library. Now that's a huge bottleneck, because if that happens, we don't always have the luxury of updating the library first. So instead, what we did was, the way we allow flexibility is by adding additional custom attributes that let you specify a default, focus, and press state up front. And what that does is it essentially packages those colors together, creates a custom color scheme on the fly, and assigns it back to the button, and it continues to build the way we just saw. Now, we have additional handling that's happening behind the scenes to make sure you don't specify a color scheme and some custom colors, and that if you choose to define a custom color scheme, you define it in totality, not partially. But that's all happening behind the scenes. But this gives us the flexibility to now not have to always wait for the library to be updated if one of the consumer apps needs to use a custom color scheme and it's urgent. And this type of flexibility is done on a case-by-case basis for each of our design patterns. So speaking of allowing for flexibility, one of the other things that we want for every library is to think about how it's going to evolve in the future. So as I mentioned, when we originally built this, we were on version 7 of the support library, which meant we were using app-compat button. Now obviously there's material design components, and we'd want to upgrade to material button. So the thing to keep in mind is, because all of this is happening within one class, it's pretty straightforward to now, instead of extending app-compat button, to switch over to material button, make the necessary updates we need to make, and now you have a button that's up to date with the latest version of material. Now this is phenomenal for us because we're supporting, I believe it's over 4 different Android apps. And normally what we would have to do is we'd have to find every single place a button is being used, update it to the latest version, retest all of those screens again, and then release each app one by one. Right now, because it's happening all within one class, we know those changes will take place everywhere it's being used, plus it's happening inside of a library. So we can start to test this in isolation and then do integration tests for each of our Android apps. Now, another interesting challenge that we came across, which we never really thought about actually, was that we didn't realize that we use such different terminology across each of our teams. Now, as Android engineers, we're obviously working with design, but most often as you're building a feature, you're typically working with the corresponding web engineers and iOS engineers. And over time, you start to notice that people call things differently. So this was a great example. As we were working on button groups, web engineers, the Android team, we were like, yeah, we totally know what button groups are, let's build them. But the iOS team was a little confused, and it turns out that in iOS, you actually call a button group a segmented control. Now, this led to further problems as we started to work on more design patterns, because we ended up having to spend time clarifying what each of us meant as we were in meetings talking to each other about how to build design patterns. And so what we decided to do was, as we built each design pattern, we essentially came up with a unified language so that anytime we built a design pattern, we called it by one name, regardless of platform. And it was the specific platform's job to understand what that term meant for them in that case. So, going forward, if the design team asks us to add a toggle, now a toggle is a very vague term, but the web engineers understood that they needed to add a checkbox, the Android team understood that we needed to add an Android switch, and the iOS team understood to add in the iOS switch as per Apple's HIG guidelines. And that helped us solve so many communication problems that we were having between each of the engineering teams, as well as with the design team. Now, we talked a lot about what style guide-driven development is, how to actually get started on mobile and build it out for yourselves, and how to even build some of the design patterns and what challenges we may face. But how do you actually get started with this whole effort? So the first step is to really understand what problems you're trying to solve. So in our case, we wanted to speed up UI development. We were spending a lot of time in VQA adjusting margins and padding, and it wasn't really the best use of our time. And we wanted to focus more on functionality rather than having to worry about if we got the margins right every single time. The second problem that we saw was decreasing the ambiguity around these design patterns. So a great example is dialogues are used all throughout the app, but they were all built very differently. And we never knew when we had to add a dialogue, which dialogue that we already built we should use. And by building out these design patterns, we started to standardize what they actually meant. So we didn't have to worry anymore about what's the right dialogue. There's only one dialogue now, and there's certain configurations that we have for it. And lastly, we wanted to improve communication with design. So as I mentioned with this unified language, that helped us improve our communication with design so that when they asked for something, they didn't have to worry about which platform team they were talking to. They just had to make sure that they were adhering to what was written in our style guide and that they were telling us the appropriate configurations to use so that we could implement what they were asking for. The next step is to identify your stakeholders. Now, design is obviously a huge stakeholder. We worked very closely with the design team to build a style guide so that we can start to build out this whole pattern library. And it wouldn't be possible without us working collectively together. The other big stakeholder is obviously engineering. We need to work very closely with the other platform teams. But what's even more important is the biggest stakeholder in engineering is your own team. So what I mean by that is it's great to build out this pattern library and to have these design patterns, but you still need to teach your team how to use them. It's very easy to have a library, but it's also very easy to not use it. So we had to spend a lot of time kind of training, in essence, how we have to build out buttons, for example, going forward. We no longer have to go through this whole process of creating drawables. We can simply use this custom view once this library is integrated. And that process has to happen as we introduce new design patterns, and people get used to doing things the old way. So it's very important that we invest time in training the team and how to use the new practices we want to implement. Now, the last stakeholder wasn't as obvious to us when we started working on this, but in our case, it was the UX research team. As we were building out these design patterns, we realized we wanted to make sure that they actually benefit not just engineering and our development process, but our users, right? Because that's who we care about at the end of the day. And so a great example of this is as we were defining what colors we use throughout our apps, the research team helped us make sure that they followed the accessibility guidelines to make sure that when we do use these colors, everyone using our app can actually see them properly. Now, the last step of this is to always start small. If you start small, it's much easier to define a process. It's much easier to find the obstacles you will face and correct them early on. And it's much easier to define how you work with other teams that are part of this entire endeavor with you. And so, as I mentioned earlier, buttons may seem deceptively simple and small, but when you take a closer look, you start to realize that they're made up of even smaller design patterns like color, shape, and typography. And so what we did was we initially started with buttons, but then backtracked to start working on defining what colors do we want to use throughout our apps first. When we talk about shape, what values do we want to work with? And then typography is defining basically what font faces, what sizes are we allowing, how do we use them, and what are the guidelines around that. And once we did that, then it was easier to then, as I mentioned with atomic design principles, build on top of those to build the buttons. Now, if you're interested in learning more, you can visit this link, which gives a more comprehensive blog post on this entire effort. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer questions off to the side of the stage, I guess. Thank you.